At the lawyer's office, where my children sat expecting to hear numbers that would secure their future, I listened as my own son leaned back in his chair and said, "Let's just be clear about this now, so there's no confusion later." His tone wasn't harsh, not loud, not even disrespectful on the surface, but there was something underneath it. Something final. "I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and tell me where you're watching from, because what unfolded in that room wasn't what any of them had planned." The office itself was quiet, professional, the kind of place where voices stay measured and decisions carry weight long after they're spoken. The lawyer sat across from us, folders neatly arranged, his expression neutral in the way people learn to be when they've seen too many families fall apart over things that were never meant to divide them. My daughter sat beside my son, her hands folded, her posture composed, but her eyes kept drifting toward the documents on the desk as if she already knew what they said, as if she had already decided what they meant. I had been asked to come in for what they described as a final discussion, something about clarity, about making sure everything was handled properly. That was the phrase they used. Properly. And for a moment, before I walked into that room, I let myself believe it. I thought maybe this was about understanding, about responsibility, about family trying to do the right thing together. But as I sat there, listening to the way they spoke, not to me, but around me, I began to understand what this meeting really was. It wasn't a conversation. It was a conclusion. My son leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. "We've been patient," he said, glancing briefly at his sister before continuing. "But we need to move forward. This can't stay unresolved." Unresolved. I folded my hands gently in my lap, my expression calm, my posture unchanged. "And what exactly is unresolved?" I asked, my voice steady, not challenging, just clear. My daughter finally looked at me then, her gaze direct but distant in a way I hadn't seen before. "The house. The assets. Everything," she said. "We need to know where things stand. Where things stand." The lawyer shifted slightly in his seat, as if sensing the direction the conversation was taking, but he didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. Because what mattered wasn't what he would say, it was what they already believed. I looked at them both, really looked, and in that moment, something settled deep inside me. Not hurt. Not anger. Just clarity. Because while they sat there expecting to hear what they were entitled to, they had no idea what I had already done. I had told myself, walking into that office, that this was simply a formality. That after everything we had been through as a family, this would be a conversation, difficult, maybe, but still grounded in some sense of mutual respect. That's what I chose to believe when my daughter called and said, "We just need to sit down and get everything in order." Get everything in order. It sounded responsible. Reasonable. The kind of thing families say when they're trying to take care of one another. So I agreed. I wore something simple, something neutral, and I arrived on time, just as I always had for every important moment in their lives. But sitting there now, watching the way they avoided looking at me directly, the way their attention stayed fixed on the documents instead of the person sitting across from them, I realized how misplaced that expectation had been. This wasn't about taking care of me. It was about taking control of what they believed would eventually be theirs. My son cleared his throat slightly, a habit he had when he was about to say something he had already rehearsed. "We've been going over the numbers," he said, tapping lightly on the folder in front of him. "And it just makes more sense to finalize things now instead of waiting." My daughter nodded beside him, her expression calm, almost businesslike. "It's not personal," she added quickly. "It's just practical." Practical. I let the word settle, not because it surprised me, but because of how easily it came to her. I remembered a time when practical meant making sure there was enough food on the table, enough savings for emergencies, enough stability for them to grow up without worry. Now, it meant something else entirely. It meant efficiency, division, ownership. The lawyer shifted slightly again, glancing at me as if offering space for me to respond, but I didn't rush to fill it. Instead, I watched. I listened. I paid attention to the details that mattered, the way my son spoke as if decisions had already been made, the way my daughter framed everything as inevitable, as if this outcome was simply the next logical step. "Look," my son continued, his tone tightening just enough to reveal the impatience underneath. "We're not asking for anything unreasonable. We just need clarity. We need to know what's ours so we can plan accordingly." "What's ours?" I folded my hands more firmly now, not out of discomfort, but out of recognition. Because that single phrase carried more truth than anything else they had said so far. Not what I needed. Not what was fair. Not what made sense for all of us. Just, what's ours? My daughter leaned forward slightly, her voice softer but no less certain. "And honestly," she said, "dragging this out doesn't help anyone. It just makes things harder." Harder. I almost smiled at that, not out of amusement, but because of how completely they had reframed the situation in their own minds. To them, the difficulty wasn't what they were asking. It was the fact that I hadn't already agreed. I looked at both of them then, really looked, and for a moment, I saw not the children I had raised, but two people who had already decided the outcome of a conversation they hadn't finished having. And in that moment, something inside me settled again. Not with resistance. Not with anger. But with certainty. Because while they were busy defining what belonged to them, they had no idea they were already too late. The lawyer finally spoke then, his voice calm and measured, the kind that carried authority without needing to raise itself. "Perhaps we should clarify the purpose of today's meeting," he said, glancing briefly between my children before resting his attention on me. But my son didn't give him much space to guide the conversation. "The purpose is simple," he said, leaning forward again. "We need to move forward with decisions that should have been made already. Should have been made already." I noticed the way he said it not as a suggestion, but as a conclusion. My daughter nodded beside him, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the folder in front of her. "We've waited long enough," she added, her tone softer, but no less firm. "At some point, things need to be finalized." Finalized. The words came easily to them, as if this was just another transaction, another step in a process they believed they had every right to control. I let my gaze rest on the documents for a moment, not because I needed to read them, but because I already understood what they represented. Not information. Not clarity. Expectation. "And what exactly are you expecting to finalize today?" I asked, my voice steady, unhurried. My son exhaled, a small sign of impatience slipping through despite his effort to stay composed. "The house, the accounts, the investment portfolio," he said. "Everything. Everything." The lawyer shifted again, this time more noticeably. "These are significant matters," he said carefully. "Typically, decisions of this nature, we're not asking for anything unusual," my daughter interrupted gently, though the interruption itself said more than her tone. "We're just trying to avoid complications later." Avoid complications. I watched the exchange closely, the way they spoke over the lawyer, the way they framed urgency as responsibility. It wasn't chaotic. It was controlled. Practiced. As if this conversation had already taken place somewhere else, without me. My son leaned back slightly, crossing his arms now, his posture settling into something more fixed. "Look," he said, "we're not trying to make this difficult. But we need to know where things stand. We can't keep waiting indefinitely." I let a small pause form before answering, not to create tension, but to let the weight of what he had said settle fully into the room. "Waiting for what?" I asked quietly. He hesitated. Just for a fraction of a second. Then he looked at his sister, and she answered for him. "For you to decide," she said. "For me to decide." I nodded slightly, acknowledging the words without reacting to them. Because what they didn't realize, what they couldn't see sitting there across from me, was that the decision they were waiting for had already been made. Not in this room. Not in front of them. But quietly, deliberately, at a time when their voices weren't guiding the outcome. The lawyer glanced at me again, more intently this time, as if sensing there was something beneath the surface of this conversation that hadn't yet been said. And he was right. There was. Because while my children were sitting there, pressing for answers they believed they deserved, they had no idea the question itself no longer applied. It was my daughter who said it next, and she said it so casually, so cleanly, that for a moment, it almost sounded reasonable. "We're not trying to pressure you," she began, her tone carefully measured, "but at some point, We need to move forward with our lives too. I turned my head slightly, just enough to meet her eyes directly, and waited. Because I had learned, over the years, that people often reveal more in what they say after a pause than in what they plan to say before it. My son leaned in again, his voice firmer now, less patient than before. We've already made arrangements, he said. Plans that depend on this being settled. Arrangements. Plans. Words that sounded organized on the surface, but underneath carried something else entirely: assumption. Ownership without permission. And if it's not settled? I asked quietly. That was when the shift happened. Subtle, but unmistakable. My daughter's expression tightened just slightly, her posture straightening as if she had reached the point in the conversation she had been working toward all along. She glanced briefly at my son, then back at me. Then we need to be honest about what that means, she said. Honest. My son didn't wait this time. It means we can't keep things the way they are, he said. The house, the accounts, it's not sustainable. Not sustainable. I let the words settle, not because I agreed with them, but because I understood exactly how they were being used. Not as facts, but as leverage. And what are you suggesting? I asked, my tone unchanged. There was a brief pause, just long enough to make it clear that this wasn't being said impulsively. This was something they had already decided. My daughter spoke first. If we can't come to an agreement today, she said, her voice calm but now unmistakably firm, then it would make more sense for you to consider alternative arrangements. Alternative arrangements. I held her gaze, waiting. My son finished it. We'd need you to move out, he said. Within an hour, preferably. So we can start transitioning everything properly. 1 hour. The lawyer shifted sharply in his chair, his professional composure breaking just enough to show discomfort. That's highly unusual, he said carefully. These matters typically require, but his words faded into the background. Not because they didn't matter, but because something else had already taken their place. I sat there, my hands still folded in my lap, my posture unchanged, and let the sentence settle completely. 1 hour to leave my own home. Not suggested. Not discussed. Declared. I looked at both of them then, really looked, and for the first time in that room, I saw not urgency, not concern, but certainty. They believed this was reasonable. That this was the natural next step. That I would either agree, or comply. And in that moment, something inside me became very clear. Not painful. Not even surprising. Just final. Because while they were giving me 1 hour to leave everything behind, they had no idea I had already removed the only thing they actually wanted. I didn't respond right away after they said it. 1 hour. The words stayed in the room, heavier than anything else that had been said before, but I didn't challenge them. I didn't argue. I simply sat there, letting the silence do what it always does, reveal more than any reaction ever could. Because when people believe they've reached the point of control, they stop being careful. They stop choosing their words. And that's when the truth becomes clear. I remembered the first time something like this had been hinted at, not as direct as today, not as sharp, but present in the same quiet way. It was a few weeks earlier, in my living room, when my daughter had been going over bills I hadn't asked her to review. No, she had said, flipping through the pages, it might make more sense if everything was consolidated. Less to manage. At the time, I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I was still listening. Still trying to understand where these suggestions were coming from. Then there were the follow-ups. My son mentioning long-term planning over dinner. My daughter casually asking if I had updated any of my legal documents recently. Small questions. Reasonable ones. The kind that don't raise concern on their own. But together, they formed a pattern. A direction. I didn't confront them then. I didn't ask why the conversations kept circling back to the same topics. Because by that point, I had already started to notice something else, the way they spoke about my life as if it were something already transitioning into their hands. Not intentionally cruel. Not openly disrespectful. Just assumed. And that assumption was what led me to make a decision they would never have expected. A few days before this meeting, I had sat across from a different lawyer. Not the one in this office. Someone I trusted. Someone who listened without trying to steer the conversation in any direction. I had brought with me everything that mattered, the details of my investment portfolio, the accounts I had built over decades, the things my husband and I had carefully managed together. It wasn't just money. It was structure. Stability. A lifetime of decisions made with intention. I want to make sure this is used properly, I had said. The lawyer nodded, waiting. Not just distributed, I added. Used. And in that quiet office, without pressure, without interruption, I made the choice. Not out of anger. Not out of spite. But out of clarity. Because once you understand how something is being valued by others, you begin to understand what you need to do with it yourself. Back in the present, I looked at my children again, sitting there across from me, still holding on to the certainty that they had just created with that one sentence, 1 hour. I saw the confidence in it. The expectation. The belief that this moment would lead exactly where they intended it to go. And I felt none of it. No urgency. No fear. No need to defend myself. Because while they believed they had just set the terms, they had no idea those terms no longer applied. The decision hadn't been complicated once I allowed myself to see things clearly. That was the part that stayed with me as I sat there in that office, listening to the quiet hum of the air conditioning, the faint rustle of paper on the lawyer's desk, and the steady confidence in my children's voices. They believed they had reached the point where everything would finally shift in their favor. But what they didn't understand was that the shift had already happened, just not where they were looking. That morning, when I met with my own lawyer, there had been no urgency in the room. No raised voices. No pressure. Just a conversation grounded in intention. "Are you certain?" he had asked me, not questioning my judgment, but making sure I understood the weight of the decision. I remember nodding once, calmly. "I am." Because by then, it wasn't about what I was giving away. It was about what I was refusing to let be taken. We went through everything carefully, the portfolio, the accounts, the structure that had taken years to build. Numbers that once represented security now carried a different meaning. Not loss. Not sacrifice. Purpose. I chose organizations that reflected the values I had lived by, causes that would continue long after I was gone, places where what I had built would actually matter. The process wasn't rushed. It was precise. Documented. Finalized. And when it was done, there was no dramatic moment. No sense of emptiness. Just a quiet understanding that something had been placed exactly where it belonged. Back in the present, I looked at the folder in front of my son, the one he had been tapping earlier with so much certainty. I wondered what he thought was inside it. Numbers. Assets. A future already mapped out in his mind. My daughter sat beside him, her posture still composed, but I could see it now, the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers rested just a little too firmly against the table. Something in the room had begun to shift, even if they hadn't fully realized it yet. The lawyer cleared his throat softly, as if preparing to guide the conversation back into familiar territory. "Perhaps we should review the current status of the estate," he said, reaching for one of the documents. I watched him for a moment, then shook my head slightly. "There's no need," I said. That caught their attention. Both of them looked at me at the same time, the first real alignment in their focus since the meeting had begun. "What do you mean, no need?" my son asked, a trace of confusion slipping into his voice. I met his eyes, steady and calm. "Because what you're expecting to review," I said, pausing just long enough for the weight of the moment to settle, "is no longer there." The room didn't react immediately. It rarely does when something important is said quietly. But I could see it begin, the first fracture in their certainty, the first moment where assumption no longer matched reality. And for the first time since I walked into that office, I knew exactly where the conversation was going next. My son leaned forward again, but this time there was no rehearsed confidence in the movement. "What do you mean, it's not there?" he asked, his voice slower now, as if he needed to hear the words more clearly to understand them. My daughter didn't speak right away. She just watched me, her expression still composed on the surface, but no longer certain. That was the difference. The certainty had started to slip. I didn't rush to explain. I had learned that when people are used to controlling a conversation, silence unsettles them more than confrontation ever could. So I let it sit there for a moment, the three of us in that quiet office, the weight of something unspoken pressing gently into the space between us. The lawyer glanced at me, then at the documents in front of him, as if he was beginning to connect something that hadn't yet been said out loud. "Are you referring to the investment portfolio?" he asked carefully. I nodded once. "Yes." My daughter finally spoke then, her voice still measured, but now edged with something tighter. "That's exactly what we're here to discuss," she said. "So what do you mean it's not there?" I folded my hands lightly in front of me, my posture unchanged. "I mean," I said calmly, "that it no longer exists in the way you're expecting it to." My son exhaled, a short, controlled breath that didn't quite hide the tension underneath. "That doesn't make sense," he said. "Those assets don't just disappear." "No," I agreed softly. "They don't." That was when the shift became visible, not dramatic, not sudden, but undeniable. My daughter's gaze dropped briefly to the folder on the desk, then lifted again, sharper this time. "Then where is it?" she asked. I met her eyes, steady and clear. "Allocated," I said. The word hung there, simple but precise. "To where?" my son pressed, the patience in his voice thinning. I let the pause return, not to create tension, but to allow the answer to land exactly where it needed to. "To organizations that will use it," I said. "Properly." The lawyer's expression changed first, just slightly, but enough. He reached for another document, flipping it open with a careful motion that suggested he already knew what he was about to confirm. "Are you saying," he began slowly, "that the portfolio has been transferred?" I nodded again. "Donated." This time, the silence wasn't uncertain. It was complete. My son leaned back in his chair, his hand pressing briefly against his forehead as if trying to process something that didn't fit into the version of reality he had walked in with. "You donated, all of it?" he asked. "All of it," I repeated, my voice calm, unchanged. My daughter didn't react the same way. She didn't lean back or look away. She stayed exactly where she was, her posture straight, her eyes fixed on me, but the control she had carried into the room was no longer intact. "When?" she asked, her voice quieter now, but sharper. "Yesterday morning," I said. The timing settled in immediately. Not weeks ago. Not months. Yesterday. Before this meeting. Before their ultimatum. Before the 1 hour. And in that moment, it became clear, not just to them, but to everyone in the room, that the outcome they had come here expecting had already been decided without them. The room didn't recover from that statement. Not immediately. Not the way people usually try to smooth things over when a conversation takes an unexpected turn. This wasn't something that could be softened or redirected. It just stayed there. My son lowered his hand slowly from his forehead, his eyes still fixed somewhere on the desk, as if the surface might offer a version of reality that made more sense than the one he had just heard. My daughter, however, didn't look away. She leaned forward slightly, her voice quieter now, but far more controlled than before. "You made that decision without telling us," she said. I met her gaze without hesitation. "Yes." The simplicity of the answer seemed to unsettle her more than anything else I could have said. Because there was no explanation attached to it. No apology. No attempt to justify it in terms she could reshape. Just the truth, exactly as it was. "That's not something you just do," my son added, his voice uneven now, caught somewhere between disbelief and frustration. "That's $2 million. I nodded slightly. "I'm aware." The lawyer cleared his throat again, more deliberately this time, his professional tone returning as he opened the document in front of him. "The transfer was processed yesterday morning," he confirmed, his eyes scanning the page before lifting toward us. "It appears to have been executed in full, with all appropriate documentation." That was the moment it became real, not just a statement, not just something I had said, but something verified, structured, complete. My daughter leaned back slightly now, her posture no longer composed in the same way. Not collapsed, but no longer controlled. "Why?" she asked, the word coming out sharper than she intended. I didn't answer immediately. Not because I didn't have one, but because the question itself needed to sit there for a moment. Why? Not what happened. Not how. Just why. I looked at her, then at my son, and let the silence stretch just long enough for the connection to form on its own. You told me I had 1 hour to leave my own home, I said quietly. Neither of them spoke. I listened, I continued, my tone unchanged. And I made a decision based on what I heard. My son shook his head slightly, as if trying to separate those two things, as if they didn't belong in the same sentence. Those aren't the same thing, he said. Aren't they? I asked gently. The question didn't need to be answered. It had already done what it needed to do. My daughter's gaze dropped to the table again, but this time it wasn't searching. It was settling. Understanding, even if she didn't want to accept it. So there's nothing left, she said, more to herself than to me. I didn't correct her. I didn't need to. Because what she meant wasn't entirely true, but it was true enough for the moment. There's exactly what there should be, I said calmly. The lawyer closed the folder in front of him, the soft sound marking the end of something that had never really begun the way they intended. And in that quiet office, with everything laid out clearly for the first time, one thing became undeniable. They hadn't lost something that day. They had simply discovered, it was never theirs to begin with. My son let out a breath that sounded more like something collapsing than something releasing. He leaned back in his chair, his earlier confidence gone completely now, replaced with something quieter, something that looked a lot like realization arriving too late. You didn't even give us a chance to fix it, he said, his voice lower, almost searching for ground that wasn't there anymore. I watched him for a moment, not unkindly, but without stepping in to soften what had already settled. You gave me 1 hour, I replied gently. That was enough. The words didn't echo, but they stayed. And in that stillness, the imbalance of the entire conversation finally revealed itself not in what had been said today, but in how easily that ultimatum had been offered, as if it were reasonable, as if it were something I would simply accept. My daughter shifted slightly in her seat, her posture no longer composed in the same careful way. There was tension in her now, not loud, not emotional, but controlled in a different direction. We weren't trying to take anything from you, she said, though the certainty behind the statement had thinned. We were trying to make things manageable. Manageable. I nodded once, acknowledging the word. Without agreeing to it. For who? I asked. She didn't answer. The lawyer remained quiet now, his role no longer to guide, but to witness. His presence in the room had changed, not as a participant, but as confirmation. Everything that mattered had already been documented, signed, completed. There was nothing left for him to mediate. My son leaned forward again, slower this time, his hands resting flat on the desk as if he needed something solid to hold on to. So that's it, he asked. There's nothing left for us. I considered the question carefully, not because I needed time to think, but because the answer deserved to be given clearly. There's everything left for you, I said. Just not what you expected. He frowned slightly, trying to understand, but I didn't rush to explain further. Some things aren't meant to be handed over in the moment. They're meant to be realized after it. My daughter exhaled quietly, her gaze drifting toward the closed folder on the desk. The same folder she had been watching so closely when we first sat down, the one she believed contained answers that would confirm everything she had already decided. Now it meant something else entirely. Not confirmation. Finality. We made plans, she said softly, more to the room than to me. I know, I replied. That was the truth of it. I knew. I had seen it forming long before today, heard it in the way they spoke, in the assumptions they didn't realize they were making. This moment wasn't sudden. It was simply the first time it had been spoken out loud. No one said anything after that. There wasn't anything left to argue, nothing left to negotiate. The structure they had come here relying on had already been removed, quietly, completely, without needing their agreement. And in that quiet, something settled into place, not just for me, but for them too, whether they wanted it to or not. Because what they had come here to claim had already been given a purpose far beyond their reach. The lawyer closed the folder completely this time, his hands resting lightly on top of it as if to signal, without saying it out loud, that there was nothing left to review. The meeting they had come for, the one they believed would define everything, had already reached its end, just not in the way they had expected. My son sat there for a moment longer, his eyes fixed on the desk, his thoughts clearly moving through something he couldn't yet fully process. My daughter, on the other hand, straightened slightly, as if trying to gather what remained of her control, even now. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice quieter, but still holding on to a thread of structure, something to anchor herself to. I looked at her calmly. "Now," I repeated gently. "Now nothing changes. At least not for me." The simplicity of the answer seemed to unsettle her more than anything else that had been said. Because she had come into this room expecting a shift, expecting ownership, transition, movement. But there was none. Not anymore. My son finally looked up, his expression no longer defensive, no longer certain, just uncertain. "You're really just going to walk away from all of it?" he asked. I held his gaze, steady and clear. "I didn't walk away," I said. "I placed it where it would matter." He didn't respond to that. Not because he didn't hear it, but because he didn't yet understand it. And maybe he wouldn't, not right away. My daughter picked up the envelope she had brought, the one she had placed on the desk at the beginning of the meeting, as if it were part of something structured, something predictable. She held it for a moment, then set it back down again, her movements slower now, less certain. "We had plans," she said again, though this time it sounded different. Not like a statement. More like a realization that those plans no longer had a place to go. I nodded once. "I know." The lawyer remained quiet, his presence now more reflective than active. He had seen this before, I imagined, not the exact situation, but the pattern. Expectation meeting reality. Control dissolving into something else. I reached for my bag then, not abruptly, not as a signal of departure, but simply because the conversation had already concluded itself. There was no need for anything further. No final argument. No dramatic ending. Just a quiet understanding that everything that needed to be said, had been said. My son watched me as I stood, his expression shifting again, something softer now, something closer to recognition than resistance. "Mom," he began, but the word didn't carry beyond that. It lingered there, unfinished, like a thought he hadn't yet learned how to complete. I gave him a small nod, not as reassurance, not as forgiveness, but as acknowledgement. Then I turned toward the door. As I reached for the handle, I paused for just a moment, not to look back, but to let the stillness settle fully into place behind me. Because what had happened in that room wasn't just a conversation. It was a line, quietly drawn, clearly understood. And once crossed, it doesn't disappear. The door closed softly behind me, not with finality, but with a kind of quiet certainty that didn't need to be announced. The hallway outside the lawyer's office was empty, the muted carpet absorbing the sound of my steps as I walked toward the exit. For a moment, I let my hand rest lightly against the wall, not out of weakness, but to feel something steady beneath my palm. Inside that room, everything had shifted, but out here, the world remained exactly as it was. And that, more than anything, grounded me. I didn't rush. There was no reason to. Whatever urgency had been created inside that office no longer belonged to me. It stayed there with them, with the questions they hadn't expected to ask, with the silence that had replaced their certainty. I stepped outside into the afternoon light, the air warmer than I remembered, the sky open in a way that made everything feel just a little bit clearer. Behind me, the door opened again. I didn't need to turn to know it was Daniel. His footsteps were familiar, even now hesitant, but determined enough to follow. "Mom," he said, his voice lower than it had been in the office, stripped of everything that had made it sound certain before. I turned then, not quickly, not dramatically. Just enough to meet him where he stood. "I didn't think you would actually do it," he said. There was no accusation in his voice. Just truth. The kind that comes when someone realizes they misunderstood something important. "I know," I replied gently. He looked down. For a moment, then back up at me, his expression shifting again, something softer now, something closer to the boy he used to be before life taught him to measure everything in terms of outcomes. "We weren't trying to push you out," he said. "Not really." I studied him for a second, not searching for an excuse, not waiting for one either. Just listening. You told me I had 1 hour, I said quietly. He nodded, the weight of that sentence settling in a way it hadn't before. Yeah, he admitted. We did. There was nothing more to add to that. No explanation that could change it, no intention that could reshape what had already been said. I thought we had more time, he added after a moment. I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. So did I said. The words weren't sharp. They didn't need to be. They carried everything they were meant to without raising my voice or asking for anything in return. He took a small step forward, as if he might say more, as if he might try to reach for something that had already moved beyond where he could easily grasp it. But then he stopped. Not because he didn't want to continue, but because he understood, at least in part, that some things don't resolve in a single conversation. I don't know what happens now, he said finally. I looked at him, steady and calm. That's up to you, I replied. Not a dismissal. Not a punishment. Just the truth. He nodded slowly, accepting it in a way that didn't require agreement, just recognition. Then he stepped back, the distance between us no longer something I needed to close. I turned again and walked toward my car, the sound of my footsteps steady against the pavement. And for the first time that day, there was nothing left to carry with me. Not the conversation. Not the expectations. Not even the disappointment. Just clarity. Because whatever came next would no longer be built on assumption. I drove home without turning on the radio, the silence inside the car matching the stillness I felt settling within me. Not emptiness, just quiet. The kind that comes after something has finally aligned the way it was meant to. When I pulled into the driveway, the house stood exactly as it always had. Unchanged by what had happened in that office. For a moment, I sat there with my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, looking at the front door, remembering all the years that had passed through it, every holiday, every argument, every moment that once defined what we called family. Then I stepped out, walked up to the door, and let myself in. Inside, the air felt familiar, steady, untouched by expectation. I set my bag down on the same table I had used for years and moved through the house slowly, not searching for anything, just noticing. The space was still mine, not because of ownership written on paper, but because I had chosen to remain present in it, fully, without needing permission or approval. That was something no document could give, and no one could take away. Later that evening, I sat by the window where the light softened as the sun went down, and I allowed myself to think not about what I had given up, but about what I had protected. Because that was the truth of it. I hadn't lost anything. I had simply refused to let something meaningful be reduced to entitlement. The money, the portfolio, the numbers they had come to claim, they were never the point. What mattered was what those things represented, and where they would go when I was no longer here to decide. My children would have to face that understanding in their own time. Not in anger, not in punishment, but in the quiet space that follows when expectations fall away and something more honest takes their place. Maybe they would come to see it. Maybe they wouldn't. That part was no longer mine to control. What was mine was the decision. And I had made it. I thought back to the moment in that office, the way my son had said 1 hour, as if time itself could be used as leverage, as if urgency could replace respect. And I realized something simple, something that had been there all along but hadn't needed to be spoken until now. Time doesn't belong to anyone who tries to control it. And neither does anything built with intention. I looked out the window as the last light faded, the quiet of the evening settling around me, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something steady. And complete. Not because everything was resolved, but because everything was clear. They had given me 1 hour to leave. So I gave everything away before they could take it. And in doing so, I didn't lose my legacy. I chose it.